Tanake Harurura. My name is Brittany Schulman. I'm Waccamaw Siouan, the Vice President of Indigenous Leadership and Education Programs at Native Americans in Philanthropy, and we are super excited to be able to hold this webinar on the Indigenous Philanthropic Professionals Report. This report was done in partnership with Change Philanthropy and really taken from their Diversity Amongst Philanthropic Professionals report 2020 that they conduct every 2 years. One of the reasons that it's so important for us is that for a long time, Indigenous peoples have not been included in reports and in data, which just leads to our continued erasure and invisibility in every sector. So one of our priorities at Native Americans in Philanthropy is to ensure that we have good research, good data, and that we're approaching it from an Indigenous perspective. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and bring into the conversation our panelists for today, letting them also introduce themselves. And we're going to start with Lyle.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today with all of my friends at NAP and everyone who's on the webinar. My name is Lyle Matthew Kahn. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am the current interim national director at Change Philanthropy and the author of the last few DAP reports.
Thank you, Lyle. I'm going to turn it over to Carly. You may not see her on the webinar. She is here, though, just a few technical difficulties. But Carly.
Ami Takayipi, Iyushkion Wachiankapie, I can see you. I apologize that you can't see me. I am having some technical issues today, but which is crazy. 2 years into COVID, you would think we'd have this down, but somehow we don't. But happy to be here. I'm executive director of Native Ways Federation, and I'm also on the board for NAP, and proud to have been a board member for the last few years. So excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you, Carly. And we'll now turn it over to Dana.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Dana Arviso, and I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. I call Seattle home now, which is home to Duwamish and Coast Salish territories. I'm currently a doctoral student at University of Washington College of Education, but my full-time job is also at the College of Education as serving as the director for Unite Ed, which is the community partnership work of the college. I'm also super thrilled to be here. I'm a former board member for Native Americans in Philanthropy. And I used to serve as the executive director for a potlatch fund and spent about a decade there. So happy to join this conversation, and I'm looking forward to us digging into this report.
Thank you, Dana. And last but not least for this conversation is Joseph Little.
We can go by Joe. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Joseph Little, or Joe Little. I am Oglala Dakota and Gabrielino Tongva, and I currently serve as the Data and Research Associate with Native Americans in Philanthropy, and calling in today to where I call home as well, now in the Northwest, a little bit south from Seattle. I live in Portland, so it's good to be with you all here today, and I'll pass it back to Brittany.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to, again, go into this really understanding our philanthropic professionals and what this looks like. So before we actually get started, we wanted to go into a little bit about the DAP report. So I'm going to turn it over to Lyle to talk a little bit about its inception, its growth, and the importance of this report.
Yeah, thanks, Brittany. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the DAP report, DAP stands for the Diversity Among Philanthropic Professionals Survey. It was something that was actually, the first DAP happened in 2018. And I'll tell you a little bit about the background because I think it's also relevant as we think about the ways that Native communities in this country don't show up in surveys, right? So I spent almost a decade as the Vice President of Research and Communications at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. We had a long history of doing our own research because, for example, Foundation Center didn't track our issues around LGBTQ grant making. So we had to do our own tracking report around trends, gaps, and opportunities related to LGBTQ grant making. Well, the number one question that I was consistently asked, besides how much money went to a specific population or geography for LGBTQ people or issue area was how many LGBTQ people work in philanthropy. And we had no idea. I mean, a lot of us thought that we could guess and tell you, right? My old boss, Ben Francisco Malbec, and I, and the old CEO of Change Philanthropy, Carly Hare, we said, oh, we know them all. We could just tell you. But we didn't. And it was not, we didn't have any scientific grounding in this. And historically, the way that demographics are counted in the sector is through the Council on Foundation Salary and Benefits Report. And kind of that title should tell you all you need to know about the focus of that report, right? It is on salary and benefits. It's a great tool for HR. It's a great tool. And we worked with them for a number of years, and I think they were really willing to try and help us. But the way that they do their surveying for salary and benefits and for demographics is they ask one person in HR to fill out a form for their entire staff. If they don't survey their staff, they don't have to submit those answers. Sometimes their categories don't match up and they can't answer that. And so we were never able to get great data on how many LGBTQ people work in the sector. There's other surveys that have tried this too, including the United Philanthropy Forum's salary and benefits report that looks at PSO salary and benefits. Some regionals, I want to give a shout out to regional PSOs, have done that as well, right? I know Philanthropy New York did it. I think Philanthropy Northwest has done it, but they were never really longitudinal and consistent in terms of they went year after year or in a kind of regular basis. So we came up with the brainchild that we were going to do our own survey. And rather than call it the gay survey, right, and just ask one question, we realized as a member of Change Philanthropy, we had this incredible opportunity to ask about a range of personal identifiers. And so we were able to ask about race and ethnicity, age, belief status, disability status. And we launched it in 2018 with 36 foundations and 947 individuals taking the survey. We did it again I'll just say from the 2018 thing, it turned out we did not know every LGBTQ person in the sector. Shocker. About 15% of the sector identified as some form of LGBTQ. And one of the reasons we didn't know how many LGBTQ people were in the sector is the majority were in the closet. In fact, LGBTQ people working in philanthropy tend to be in the closet at a higher rate than LGBTQ people in corporate America. So that was a major finding for us. We also realized after doing that survey, this is a great tool for the sector, and it doesn't really belong at funders for LGBTQ issues. It's a bigger project. It's a project that really affects all of the identity-based philanthropy serving organizations and really belonged at Change Philanthropy. So I moved to Change Philanthropy in 2020 as a senior fellow to kind of rehome and expand the diversity among philanthropic professionals survey. In 2020, we were able to get 124 foundations participate and reached 2,390 individuals working in the sector. I mentioned both those numbers because while we're still trying to get more foundations to participate, and if anyone is a foundation on this call and wants to participate in 2022, you can still sign up. I know we keep saying it's past the deadline, but if you email me, and I'll drop my email after this, you can sign up until we launch the survey on April 11th. So we can still get you in the system, and we would love to have you participate. But the reason I mentioned those numbers is we do take Council on Foundation salary and benefits report as kind of a benchmarking to say how well are we representing the sector, thinking that that's pretty much the known universe of professionally staffed foundations in the sector. And they typically cover 700 to 800 foundations. So on that side, we're doing not so great, but they represent 7,000 to 8,000 individuals in the sector. So because we focus on some of these larger foundations, we are ultimately reaching about a quarter to a third of the folks that work in the sector. And, one of the things that's important to note for this call, I think, and we can talk about some of the findings later, this is just to give you a background of what is DAP is, we saw a lot more diversity in 2020 in general. We saw a growth in the number of people of color. We saw a huge spike in the number of people identifying as people with disabilities. So we could talk about this. This was, again, a survey taken during the COVID pandemic. So a lot more people suggesting that they had mental health issues or chronic illnesses than we had seen. And we saw growth in the number of immigrants almost across the board. But the growth was not even, first and foremost, right? In fact, the percentage of people working in the sector that identified solely as Indigenous or Native actually dropped. And I know that's going to be something that we spotlight later today. And so from that perspective, right, it's like, there's some diversity stuff happening, but we know that we need to do this work at a deeper level. And the other thing I'll mention is just like we had the outness question in 2018, we decided that we wanted to do this for all facets of an individual's identity. So we worked really closely at Change Philanthropy with our research working group, which Joe is a part of and helped us do all of this throughout the years. I do want to shout out that while the DAP is branded as Change, it is really all of the Change partners that put their expertise into this project. So NAP was a huge part of that. And what we decided to do is we created what was called the Change Philanthropy Reception of Identity Index, or Change Philanthropy RII, because we clearly like really boring names that boil down into really weird acronyms. So the Change Philanthropy Reception of Identity Index, or RII, asks along people based on their race and ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their age, their belief system, how do they feel their workplace as a whole responds to that component of their identity from a scale from actualized all the way to exploited. And what we found is that while in general, 85% of folks had a positive perception of their employer as related to their race and ethnicity, people of color were 33 times more likely to feel exploited in the workplace. So again, for me, my big takeaway is we're getting a more diverse sector. The diversity is not happening across the board, right? It doesn't just happen by magic that, hey, we're getting more diverse and every community is being lifted up. And we know that there's a lot deeper DEI work for all of us to do. And so I'm so glad, the goal is all change partners have access to this data. I'm thrilled that NAP took the initiative and is the first one to put out their own kind of analysis of it as kind of a companion piece to the DAP. I'm thrilled to have that conversation. And yeah, for any foundations that want to participate, we would love to have you participate and have your staff and voices be heard in this survey.
Thank you so much, Lyle. We're now going to go to Joe to talk a little bit more about this branch off of the DAP report and how the IP report, I love those acronyms, kind of showed up as we were looking at the data.
The DAP and the IP, yes. So I'll go ahead and share my screen just to ground the conversation for today with the findings that we were able to gather from the report. Brittany, am I sharing the correct screen? Okay, great. Have to make sure. So as Lyle said, through this partnership, we were able to really hone in on the Indigenous participants in the DAP survey so we can better understand who are Indigenous peoples working in philanthropy, specifically professionals, and where are they located, and specifically just the demographics, so that we can better understand, and also for foundations to better understand as well, as Lyle mentioned, who are working for them. So as we can see here, for Indigenous people in philanthropy by age, it is most represented among those of age group 40s. And I'll go through the slides and then I'll put together some points afterwards that I have, but let me click next. There we go. So next we have Indigenous people in philanthropy by gender identity. And those Indigenous respondents to the survey were most represented among those identifying as female. And as we look by region, we can see that those who participate in the survey are most represented among the Pacific region. And we took some more time to look at this breakdown as well. And as we're looking at this, there are many questions that arise of, okay, what are the reasons for why 3.3% of respondents who are Indigenous are represented in the Southern region? So these are questions that we're continuing to ask ourselves. Is this a question of representation? Is this a question of those who are working in philanthropy? So this is data that's really critical and crucial, not only for us as a Native-led organization, but for foundations who hire Native professionals to work in philanthropy. And as we can see here by foundation type, Indigenous peoples are most represented among private foundations. And in relation to the remaining representation, we can see that they're next most represented among public foundations. And then to look at the last key point that we were able to pull together from this IP report, we can see that Indigenous peoples in philanthropy are most represented amongst workforce sizes of 20 to 49 employees. So it's middle range size of a foundation or of a, yeah, I'll stick with foundation because that can expand to community foundation and private foundation. So when we look at all this, what does this all mean? And to really ground the conversation, I'll leave a lot of key points for the conversation that we're having today with Carly, Lyle, and Dana as well. But it's, I would say 3 words, just cultivation, consultation, and fostering. So cultivating research, like Lyle had mentioned, in a manner that respects Indigenous research principles and Indigenous peoples. consultation with Indigenous researchers, and fostering knowledge systems that respect those. And so those are some key points that we really wanted to bolster through this report in collaboration with Change Philanthropy.
Thank you so much. And that actually leads to our conversation of the first question of what does culturally informed research actually mean to you? And I'll just start with Lyle again, coming from the DAP report, which isn't specifically looking at Indigenous identities, but is looking at multiple identities.
Yeah, I mean, I think culturally informed, it's one of those things when we were preparing for this call, I think I told Brittany and Joe, I said, it should just be so obvious, right? You ask the people that you're going to go survey, like how they identify, what are the terminologies and languages that they use, right? And so for the DAP survey, it was really important that we work with the change partners and that we don't get stuck in this kind of rigid mindset, right? You know, we know that there's going to be an evolution to language and terminology as things go on. You know, as I think it's pretty obvious, I'm a gay man. And there's a conference in the LGBTQ space called Creating Change. And it's the largest LGBTQ movement space. And there's a lot of young people there. I mean, I was feeling old at like 25 when I would go to this conference. And these folks have, you know, a beautiful spectrum of ways that they talk about their identity. And a part of me just wants to sometimes be like, okay, can you just tell me if you're gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual? But it's actually really beautiful. And it informs our research as an organization that wants to be on the cutting edge of LGBTQ communities. And I think anyone that wants to be on the cutting edge of research needs to talk to communities about how they self-identify, right? And so one of the beautiful things about the DAP is that it has been this partnership with all of the change partners where we were able to ask DAP. You know, I'll give a beautiful example. So in our DAP survey around questions around Indigenous communities and Native communities, right? We worked with the team at NAP to talk about, well, what are some of the subcategories we want? And we also worked with them because we asked around religious belief system to make sure that we were creating enough religious belief system options for people that identify as Indigenous in this country to select something that would resonate with them. So that's just an example of where, you know, if we had done this on our own, we would not have been able to. I will say too, there's a section for people to write in tribal affiliation. We decided we weren't going to spell out every single tribal affiliation since folks might have multiple tribal affiliations too. But in the DAP report, you can see where folks had their tribal affiliation. And I will say that was part of the beautiful partnership is you all were able to help us level up. You know, I'm half Chinese, half Irish. I had no clue what some of these, you know, Indigenous religions were that we should be noting in the survey, and you all were able to help present that.
Thank you. I'm also going to pass this question to Carly as well, knowing some of the work that you're currently doing. You know, what does culturally informed research mean to you?
You know, I mean, building off what's already been shared, it really is whose story are we telling here, and who's in charge of the narrative? And I know we've got some more questions that are going to dig into that here, but it's so important, especially in this field of philanthropy, where in general data is an issue in Indian country, where we know that data has been inconsistently and inaccurately calculated to the detriment of our communities, and that includes philanthropy. And so when we talk about, you know, we all share this less than 0.5%, you know, 0.4% of the large foundation dollars are going to Native communities. Within that number, like, we don't even know how like the percentage of what's going to Native led organizations. Like, it's just like the data is a huge issue. And, you know, just from my experience, I worked at a foundation. I was a program officer for 6 years, and knew very few other Native program officers. And so understanding these systems within these organizations and how they're capturing this data is really important, and how we can like work together to better represent our Native communities in the data, because numbers matter when it comes to the stuff. Like, it shouldn't, but it does. Like, it ends up, you know, dollar amounts are calculated by folks. And so Yeah, so that's like, we have to connecting with Native communities, making sure that Native representation is there at the staff level is huge. And understanding how trust-based philanthropy, and I know it's kind of a buzzword right now, but what does that really mean? And how does that connect to the data piece is a big thing too. So I have a lot to say, but I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much. And Dana, can you also answer this question?
Absolutely. I'm going to come at this question from a slightly different vantage point. As someone that spent, a considerable amount of time in the field of Native philanthropy, but also is now kind of in training to become a researcher. And I want to just start by telling a little bit of my story. So my initial passion for kind of research developed when I was an undergraduate student, and I was studying child development in the late 90s. During that time, I spent a lot of hours in the library reading so much kind of deficit-based research that largely blamed Native American children and families for their own achievement gap. Eventually, that extended into my first post-college job, where I worked within my home tribal community in Bishop, California. And I was really struggling to push back on our local public schools' frustrating impression that Native preschoolers didn't arrive at kindergarten equipped with the right literacy skills. So those experiences made me want to go to graduate school and become a researcher so I could write about our strengths. Because what I was also witnessing at that time was all of these strengths around language, stories, cultural teachings, families, and the wisdom and the teaching of our elders. But I wasn't seeing that in the research at that time. Instead, what I saw is something that's kind of referred to as like damage-centered research. And it's something that Dr. Eve Tuck writes a lot about, in particular in her letter, Suspending Damage, a letter to communities, where she talks about like the impact of like decades of that type of research, like gets into our minds and starts to make us think of ourselves as being broken. So with that in mind, I think one of the other reasons that I decided to come back and finish my degree after my time at Potlatch Fund was that I really wanted to try to make sense of the experiences that I had when I was in the sector. And so I've done a lot of like reading, a lot of thinking about Indigenous and decolonizing methodologies, and I'm trying to sort of bring that back into my understanding of our field of Native philanthropy. So I think there's 3 points that I'd like to make. And I think the first is that I really think that Indigenous research methodologies are centered around this concept of relational accountability. And this is something that Dr. Sean Wilson talks about when he says that it's like this idea of the responsibility that as a researcher, you're answering to all of your relations when you're doing this type of research. It also means that we really try to embody, I think, these 4 values that NAP has been talking about for a long time, which is respect, reciprocity, relationships, and responsibility. So I think it's so important to carry those values through the work that we do, not just in philanthropy, but when we're thinking about what it means to do research with our communities and not just on them or for them. I think the other important thing that comes out is that it's so important to understand that research, like the difference between research that's conceptualized and designed by Indigenous people. And I think part of that is just to think about how it can be used to positively impact our communities. And that idea really inspires me to move beyond simply describing the problem, which I think researchers are really good at doing, but then moving more towards identifying and working towards what are the solutions to those problems. And then lastly, I go back to that letter to communities by Dr. Eve Tuck to really center myself in this idea that we no longer have to share our stories of pain to legitimize our needs. Instead, I think when we conceptualize our research, we need to really go back to highlighting those strengths, the beauty and the resilience that we know is within our people and our communities.
Thank you so much. And we're going to just dive into that so much more in our next question. But before we go, I do want to ask Joe that just culturally informed research, what does that mean to you?
I think many great points have been brought up, and I won't reiterate too much, but I will add from a different vantage point. And similar to Dana, I'm a bookworm. I learn much from those who come before me and those who will come after me. And so thinking in generational terms. So I'll share a book. So the book that I really rely upon is Decolonizing Methodologies. It's one of my favorite. There are many other books and texts out there. This book itself has really opened my mind because I know who I am as an Indigenous person, as I will continue to learn more about through my elders and through my family. But my relationship to research is continuing to grow. And what does it mean for me as an Indigenous person, as a researcher, as a data steward? That is something that I'm continuing to learn myself. So I walk into I would say answering this question as culturally informed research with an open mind of knowing that I will never know everything, and I will always continue to learn. And I would add on that thought and making sure that as myself and as other researchers conduct research on Indigenous people, is that we do our own due diligence to make sure that we minimize our own potential biases that we bring to the table, and how we are analyzing data as well, and really assessing what is the purpose. And so if we ground ourselves with purpose, then we can know that we're doing things for a good reason. So it's a very much value-based system that we're approaching from culturally informed research. And yes, there are many tactical steps that we're doing with methodologies, but from a value-based research framework, I would say that we can all be more culturally informed with how we are representing and how we are engaging with Indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate all of what you've said. And I want to go into these reports, DAP, IP. How do they elevate the philanthropic community's understanding of its Indigenous workforce and leadership? And I'm going to just switch it up and go to Carly first, since we've had a chance to hear a little from Lyle about its inception, a little from Joe about where it came from. So what do you think, Carly?
Yeah, well, first I do want to share Decolonizing Methodologies. That book changed my life, honestly. So just appreciate that was brought up. It's an amazing book about Indigenous research. And, you know, what I want to share, I guess, we are natural storytellers as Native people. Like we are storytellers, and data tells a story. And the problem is we have not had, well, there's many problems, but one of them is that like we have not been in charge of what that story is. And so the story that's been being told about us has come from others. And that has had a detrimental impact when it comes to funding and things like that. You know, I love everything that Dana was sharing and about the importance of focusing on our strengths. And that's what needs to happen, is we need to be able to be in charge of sharing our stories, so that we can share those strengths. Because what's happening in particular in the field of philanthropy, but other sectors as well, is our, like, the negative things are what's shared. It's how bad things are. Things are so bad in Indian country, and that's what folks hear about, rather than like all the really cool things. Like, we've got so many amazing things that are happening. Can we lift those up and get those funded, and, you know, try to focus on that stuff so that our kids are proud, you know? I'm a single mom of a young Native boy, and I want him to be proud of who that's, my goal is for him to be proud of who he is, and to see all of these strengths in our community, and to feel it. And so, like, how can we navigate that and connect it with, because it does connect with this data stuff. It really does. Like, it may not seem like it does, but it does, because it's storytelling. It's all storytelling. And it's all about who is in control of the story. And for too long, other people have been in control of our story. And so how can we make sure that these numbers and this data is reflective of who we are, and is reflective of the story that we want to tell?
Thank you so much, Carly. I tell Joe often, my mom said that numbers don't lie, but people do. So being able to be the one who explains the numbers is always super important. And I'm going to go over to Dana. How does this research really elevate our understanding of the Indigenous workforce and leadership?
It's a good question. I think one of the things that it's so important to understand why Indigenous people enter, stay, and leave the field of philanthropy. I'm thinking back to like one of the reports that in my mind stands out as one of the first to really talk about this. And that was when AbbVie did their report in 2014 of the exit interview. And it was about perceptions on why Black professionals leave grant-making institutions. And I think what stood out to me about that was like it's complicated. I mean, it's both, we can see in the data the trends of why people leave. And I think when we look at this data, we can see that 63% of the Indigenous people in philanthropy are in their 30s and 40s, but that number really starts to trickle down in when people are in their 50s and 60s. And, I think being able to look at that report and maybe get some personal narratives about why people are entering, staying, and leaving the field would really help us to understand, for NAP and other allies, what can we do to sort of proactively address the issues? I think when I think about my own story, it was deeply personal about why I left the field. It was a combination of like overwork and burnout coupled with chronic health issues. And I think another thing that stood out to me when I looked at the overall report of the 2020 DAP findings was that 4.5% of people that identified as having a disability, that was due to chronic illness. And I never really thought of my chronic illness journey as being a disability. I think part of it, I was just too busy dealing with it. But when I see myself and part of my story reflected between these two reports, it helps me, I think, not only feel seen, but to understand like, oh, that's something that's happening to other people. The other thing is that, I want to emphasize not just people that leave the field, but, I think entering the field is also a really interesting story. I don't know anybody that from a young age said that they wanted to grow up to be a philanthropist. I think we sort of find our way into this field. And, if someone had told me when I was 10 years old that I could grow up to give away money to communities, I don't think I would have known that's even a job. But, I think it's important for us to like continue to cultivate and train and support the next generation of Indigenous philanthropists. So I'm really excited that NAP is starting to do some of that work around youth grant making. And it leads me to also want to say just one last thing, which is getting back to like those shifts in the numbers of the ages of people in the field. What I notice about that of the 15% are in their 50s and then only, I think, 8% in their 60s, is that many of our Native elders are leaving the field to retire. And while I want our elders to be able to enjoy their golden years, I also really think about the important role that people like Dr. Valerie Johnson at Kellogg Foundation and Tia Oros and Chris Peters at Seventh Generation Fund and Barbara Poley at Hopi Foundation played in not just welcoming me to the field when I started as an executive director at 35, but also the ways that they continued to mentor me over the years. I just want to give a shout out to Valerie Johnson in particular, because she really encouraged me to finish my doctorate degree and then return to the field so that I might be able to leverage my degree and my experience and take on larger leadership roles. So I just wonder, like, who are those people going to be for our next generation of young Indigenous philanthropists?
Dana, can I just thank you for bringing up Valerie? I mean, she was, I think a lot of people don't know, she was probably like the only Native person working at a foundation for years, as far as we know. And the impact she had was huge. And I think I don't think she gets the credit that is due. Folks in philanthropy know, but a lot of other folks don't know how amazing she is and the amazing impact she's had. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I also want to bring up, Valerie was part of creating this Native Professionals Network, this Native Philanthropy Professionals Network that NAP is now hosting. It started with First Nations Development Institute, and now NAP hosts it. And when we started, my first experience with the group was like, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and there were only like 12 of us. And that just goes to show, like, when we talk about the data and the numbers, like, we need more Native people working in the field. I mean, we could only find like 12 of us. And there's more now, and we're starting like that. I know that group is being expanded to not just be program officers, but folks in other roles. And so that's great. And we're starting to see more Native folks getting role. I mean, I know Matt Morton, I mean, he just got this amazing, he's president now of this foundation, which is super cool. And, we've got Daniel Lem, who's a CFO of a community foundation. Like, we're seeing these changes, but we need to lift them up, and we need to hear about them, and we need to talk about them, and we need to see more of this. So just wanted to throw that out there. Super grateful, Dana, that you brought up Valerie, because she was a huge she doesn't, I don't think she gets enough attention, quite honestly. And so let's give her as much attention as we can as far as being a Native philanthropy idol, if you will.
No, thank you so much, both of you. I second and third that. She has always been someone who has really embodied our Indigenous values of not just thinking of her place in space at this time, but who's coming after her and who's coming after them. So I do want to second and third anti-Val. But in moving forward, we do want to ask both Joe and Lyle about how does this research elevate our understanding. So I'll go to Joe and then Lyle.
So much has been shared already. I'll keep it short since I want to save some time for Lyle as well. In relation to understanding of a community's understanding of its Indigenous workforce and leadership, I'll go back to one of my previous thoughts of like, why are we doing all this work? Why are we data stewards? Why are we doing research? And I come from a mindset of looking at things as an ecosystem. So there's a before, there's a present, and then there's an after. And right now we are in the present. So we are presenting this research. We have conducted everything in by methodologies, and But the most important piece is the aftermath. So what is being done with this research? And so I would say, as far as elevation, it would be the work that is done with this research. So how are foundations, to Lyle's point earlier, increasing their native staff, and are they hiring more natives, and boosting that representation, so that representation is reflective of the work as well, because this has been shared as well in this discussion, that Indigenous peoples are storytellers, they're knowledge keepers, and so they hold the knowledge of what are the needs in the community. And to Dana's point earlier, I'm very proud that I was able to serve as a youth grant maker in my own high school. I attended high school back in Southern California, and we had a cohort of about 10 not native youth, but we had a cohort of 10 youth I represented for Native population. But after our inaugural cohort, they then expanded it to a second cohort that was specific for Native youth grant makers in Southern California, connected with the community foundations down there. So, like I said, ecosystem. So there are multiple answers to this question, but I would say that representation and what we are doing with this work really will show the importance to foundations and other communities' understanding of who we are.
And Lyle?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I just want to say, first and foremost, is we're talking also about, make sure that the basics, right? Make sure you talk to Native communities and engage them in this research. Look at all the brilliance on this call. Everyone has just said such brilliant things. Like this should be, the no-brainer. This is all, you need to look no further, although you should also look further. But I think that, there's just some really brilliant things that people have said. I really particularly like, Carly, what you were saying around data as a story. And one of the things I've often said is data is a language, actually. And that I think if it's a language, if we're not present in that language, then we're invisibilized, right? I also spent time as the interim vice president of programs at Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy. Basically, I feel like I've just worked at almost every change partner at this point, but I spent some time there, and there's a similar issue in AAPI communities around a lack of disaggregated data and just an invisibilization and a grouping of AAPI communities into this one monolith that just obscures the fact that AAPI people have the widest wealth disparities of any community in the United States, with some AAPI people being at the very top and others being at the very bottom. And it just, without that data aggregation, we're not able to tell that story or talk about that. And I think for me, when we talk about what can be elevated or how can we improve our understanding with this, right? I mean, it's partially that, right? We need to insert ourselves in the conversation. And I think, there's even if you need to start somewhere, even if the data is not perfect, you need to have something to insert yourself in the conversation. Then people can challenge it. They can push back on your assumptions, right? They can push back on your research. But if you don't even have the research, you're not sitting at the tables with all these conversations where all these conversations are happening. And so I think that's really important. And I think, about elevating our own understanding, I just want to keep going back to the point of, investing for the foundations on this call, right? For investing into a variety and investing in Native-led kind of research opportunities, right? Most grant makers would say that they want to support a healthy ecosystem of organizations. For whatever reason in philanthropy, we've decided we should put all of our chips into Candid, and that's going to be the one end all be all in terms of research, right? And I think there's a great opportunity for us right now to rethink that model as grant makers, and to look at organizations like NAP, like other groups that are doing research that, even 2 years ago, I would say NAP wasn't doing the kind of research they're doing today. And this is a really exciting time to explore those kind of opportunities, to invest in those kind of nascent opportunities, to go beyond, to allow these various voices into the conversation, to allow them access into the language of data, and to, push back against some of the stories that are out there. If data is a story, it's language, right? Numbers don't lie. I actually think sometimes numbers do lie. We've seen numbers from Candid lie about investment in Native communities in the past. And so it's time for us to kind of, interject our own voices and have our own numbers so that we can compete with that conversation, as opposed to saying, hey, this is wrong. We could say, hey, this is wrong, and this is what the numbers should be.
Thank you so much. We're going to do one more question for everyone. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll hopefully be able to get to a couple of them before we end our call today. So our last question, and I'm actually going to start with Dana. how can the sector partner with Indigenous communities while conducting research on Indigenous professionals and communities? And how can the sector advance the narrative of Indigenous communities?
It's a big question, and I'm looking at how much time we have left. First, I just want to also shout out a couple more important Native women that have also mentored me. And I'm seeing that they're actually part of our attendees today. So I just want to give some appreciation to Dr. Cheryl Crazybull and also Lucille Echohawk. Have been, in this field for a long time, and I think are also great about bringing people in and helping them be successful. On this question of how can the sector better partner with Indigenous communities, I think about this a lot. And actually, NAP and myself are embarking on trying to figure this out. And part of it is that tomorrow I'm going to start, I'm actually going to officially launch my dissertation research project. And I want to just briefly say something about that. So my research proposal is about reclaiming philanthropy and recentering Native giving and respect, reciprocity, relationships, and communal responsibility. And so I'm looking to start recruiting people to talk to that work, are either Native professionals in the field or are allies that would love to talk about how they're supporting the work that we're doing. And I think one of the things I just want to highlight about that is that, I think part of it starts with the relationship that we are building, that I'm building with NAP, because I think one of the things we want to do is really seek to collaborate all the way through from the design phase through the research to the knowledge sharing phase. And I think that's important because sometimes we only do a snippet of that. And we only do it at the end when it's time to kind of share findings and not necessarily at the onset, which in this case, I really want to know, what does NAP want to know? I have my own set of questions that I think can bend and fold into that. But I think it's really important to center these kinds of research projects in what does the field want to know? I think my goal in a report like this is that it goes on to kind of form the basis of a body of meaningful work and kind of contributes to that theory of change that our funders keep telling us they need to resource our efforts. And I lastly just want to say that, I think that Indigenous people, I would say that Linda Smith has said this very well in her book that so many of us have read. Indigenous people are tired of being the subject of research for the sake of research. And instead, they want to hold research accountable so it actually leads to that tangible social change. So I'll leave it there because I know we have quite a few more people to respond to this.
Absolutely. And so I'll pass it over to Lyle.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've talked a lot, so I'll just say I think ditto everything that the brilliant Dana said, and I think that everyone else will say here. And I think it's I love that part that you ended on, Dana, about not just research for the sake of research, but research with the real goal at the end. And I think that that's likely what you get when you partner with Native organizations that are doing this, right? Because they're not just doing it just to check a box and say that, oh, hey, DEI is trendy right now. I just did this. Look at me, yay. And I think that there's a great opportunity for folks to continue to partner with NAP and with a bunch of organizations. And certainly I could say, at Change Philanthropy, as a POC organization, we're committed to making sure Native voices are fully engaged. So we'll just plug again that the DAP and the IPP rely on DAP data. So anyone who wants to, thank you, Kelsey, who's been amazing at managing this chat. I feel like I need a Kelsey on our team now for dropping the email in there, because we'd love to have you be engaged.
Thank you so much. Kelsey will not be leaving us anytime soon. But Joe, just wanting to go to you on the very large question.
I will give another shout out to Kelsey as well. I've been just keeping up with everything. He's been sending out lots of information. So 2 questions. It's the partnership and narrative change. So with regards to partnership, I'll keep it brief as well. intentionality and specificity is really crucial. I speak very anecdotally. So say it's a research on Indigenous peoples from the Northwest region. There's must be intentionality and specificity of which tribes and which communities researchers engage with. Not all, I mean, it's common knowledge, and we've shared this among this conversation today too. It's common knowledge among us that we're not all the same. We all come from different people. And even for some of us, some of us are raised in urban communities in comparison to growing up back on our tribal lands. So I would say that it's really crucial that for partnerships, it's important, and I'll speak to our Tribal Nations initiative that we host under NAP, being intentional about engaging with tribes directly and being intentional about speaking to community leaders, something that we were able to do as well in one of our previous reports, the COVID report tracking grant making that was occurring during the early period of the pandemic, how Native youth were really playing a big role in starting GoFundMes. And, you know, I call it, this is my lingo, but at-home grant making. You can start a GoFundMe, and like they were able to generate millions of dollars to support their community. And so I would say by partnership, it being intentional about who you are engaging with and making sure that there's purpose to that, not just, you know, a Native person, and but if they are somebody who can help you find and connect with somebody else to consult with, I would advise to that point. With regards to narrative change, I started when I was sharing the figures about Indigenous knowledge system frameworks. So the work that we're all doing, if we were to create an acronym for it, we can call it Indigenous knowledge systems. Right now, what we're doing with research is creating knowledge system for philanthropy on Indigenous professionals. So I like to use other analogies as well. We can't fit a square peg into a round hole. So in order for this work and for narrative change to happen, there's a need to continue to create new knowledge systems and refine knowledge systems as we are continuing research, like Dana's work right now that she's working on her dissertation is being intentional and engaging with communities. And I'll close it on that note, but yeah, always continuing to be open-minded that there are things that we will always learn, because there are many communities of Indigenous peoples across the US and abroad as well. And so we will always have something to learn as we are conducting research.
Thank you, Joe. And before I go to Carly for our last word, if you do have a quick question, please feel free to put it in the chat. And I did have an elder once say to me that I will not shave off the sides of my circle to fit into your box. And so we know that that's something that we'll never want to actually engage in, of making us fit into something that doesn't fit, but allowing us to be able to tell our story the way we know it should be told. So Carly, how can the sector partner with Indigenous communities, and how can the sector advance narrative change?
Absolutely. I think really quick, I do want to honor Auntie Lucille Echohawk made some comments in the chat, and I just want to recognize her and her contributions to the sector. And also she brought up Luis Delgado, who was a huge, a huge person in the field of Native philanthropy. So I just want to bring that up. So to the question of what can the sector do when it comes to support us, give us money. Like, quite frankly, like, we need resources. And like, the other thing is to understand, one of the things that I really appreciate about, our organization, we're a federation of these 7 amazing Native nonprofits. Some could say like, oh, we should be in competition for each other for money. But we have a common agenda item, and we want to work together on, making things better in this sector. And similarly, with my work with Eric and NAP, like we're having those same conversations of when we talk to funders, because quite frankly, I hear this all the time, is, well, should I fund you or should I fund them? Fund all of us. You need to fund all of us. It's long overdue. And you can do this. So that's the biggest thing, I guess, I will put out there is just resources. We need resources because we're working together. We're in conversation. We're in relationship with one another and trying to make a difference in this world that is not only going to be better for our own Native communities, but it's going to be better for everybody.
Thank you so much, every one of you, for sharing your story, for sharing your experience. We definitely, I want to double, triple down on that. Fund Indigenous people doing research, fund our organizations. It has been long overdue and it continues to be a need. And just to add to the conversation, you can partner up, whether it's Native Americans in Philanthropy, whether it's with Carly, whether it's with Dana. There are so many people who are doing amazing things that want to make sure that this work is continuing and moving forward. So feel free to reach out as much as you need to, with the understanding that we are wanting this to be, we want data to be more reflective of our story as we tell our story. So with that, and seeing no questions, thank you so much for attending. We will be sharing the recording later on in the week. Thank you, Joe, Lyle, Carly, Dana, for sharing your thoughts. And we look forward to seeing you soon. And if you would like to see us again and at least have another conversation about data, we do have our gathering in Seattle, June 26th through 29th in conjunction with APIP. So thank you so much. Would anyone else like to say a closing remark?
I just want to say thanks for the invitation to serve as a panelist. It's always so great to have a chance to talk with Lyle and Carly, and I've just really appreciated the conversation that we've had today. So thank you so much.
And I'll just say thank you to the incredible NAP team, who always does a fabulous job of pulling this all together.
Thank you so much.